Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited and also a little nervous, to be honest. It's my first conference talk, so just bear with me for the next 20 minutes. But I'm also excited to, connect this time at the conference with my actual research topic. Last time just as a watcher, and this time a bit more involved. Before I start with my actual topic of sponsorship authenticity in esports, I'll give you a little bit of background to myself. Maybe this will explain some things later on before diving into the actual presentation and topic. So my background is actually in psychology. So I did a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology at the TU in Dresden, so Technical University. Well, my master's was in human performance and socio-technical systems, which is just some fancy words for some areas of psychology. And before coming back to academics and the university, I did a little detour into recruiting and HR management for 2 years. But since 2024, I am now a PhD student at the Hamburg University of Technology at the Institute for Innovation Marketing. So a little bit of a different field where I'm now pursuing a PhD. This has so far nothing to do with esports yet, but I'll get to that in a minute. My relation to gaming and esports lies in my childhood, I'd say, like for most people here probably. I've been playing games since I was 6, but I had actually nothing to do with esports until a few years back when I met a very dedicated Shen support player that I censored in the picture on the right, who kind of gradually pulled me into the esports space, and I got a little bit familiarized with what that even is. And I'd probably not call myself a gamer in a traditional sense anymore. I guess that's part of adulthood, not much time, but more of a backseat gamer right now, but enjoying that very much. And when I was looking for a PhD topic last year that had anything to do with innovation or marketing, because, well, that's the team I'm working in now, but those were areas I knew nothing about before starting here, I was actually asking myself mainly with what kind of industry I want to work with, and especially what kind of people I want to work with throughout this harrowing PhD journey. And I actually ended up convincing my professor, who also has never heard of esports until I introduced him last year, that I could base my whole research in this industry. And so far, I do not regret my choice, especially when working with this community, not just in research, but also outside of it. But as I said, I come from a psychology background, which means I'm mainly interested in why people do what they do and think what they think, and especially how I can extract those thoughts from their heads. But yeah, as I'm in a marketing institute, what could I look at in esports? And of course, it's marketing, so I have to look at some data, some market data, revenue numbers, and this is how this all started. This is probably nothing new for most of you, but esports as an industry has been growing over the past 15 years in revenue significantly from like $1 billion in 2017 to about 4 times that by now. But despite this expansion, the economic foundations remain more or less underdeveloped, which can also be seen in the very high dependence of the whole industry on sponsorships. Sponsorships make up 40 to 80%, depending on the source you ask, of the overall revenue stream in esports, which means, well, we need them and we need them desperately to keep the industry running. But even though more and more brands and companies have been entering the esports space as sponsors and collaboration partners, especially during COVID-19 when the industry was booming and gaining reputation and relevance and everyone wanted a piece of that, there were also a lot of sponsors who since then left the esports market again, and a lot of them left it for good. The question is why? Like, why is it so hard to obtain sponsors? Why is it so hard to retain them? And yeah, sponsors have kind of a hard time. It's just sometimes kind of dependent on the infancy status of the industry, which comes with challenges not just for esports organizations, teams and players, of course, but also for the sponsors themselves, because the market is very volatile. And these volatile processes are dependent on the sponsors, because if a sponsor pulls out of the market, we can see that sometimes immediately in tournaments being cancelled midway, in players, but also whole teams just disappearing from the space. But it's also a risk factor for the sponsors themselves, right? So they have a hard time getting their return of investment in a traditional sense, I would say. So they have to redefine kind of what a successful sponsorship in esports is for them, what they want to achieve, and how to measure that. And we can see those troubles in practice, that there are problems with the return of profit for investments, that there are declining investors and sponsors, and that they kind of dry up. That's more the numbers and finance side, but on the other side, what sponsors can gain is, of course, brand awareness, brand recognition, but that also comes with a risk, especially in esports, because we are apparently a very skeptical audience when it comes to marketing and sponsorships in our favorite games, tournaments, and events. Because the esports audience is particularly skeptical of perceived exploitation. So if we get the feeling that a sponsor is just here to make some money and is not really interested in developing the esports space, or not really interested in the game or the people there, esports fans can react rather hostile, which can be seen mostly in negative electronic word of mouth, which also spreads very quickly because we are a very digital community. So of course, talking about sponsorships in a negative way can spread far and wide and quick, which is very damaging for the sponsor's reputation, which they are of course afraid of. And if that happens, they pull out of the industry and likely never come back. This is especially hard for non-endemic sponsors. If we look at some examples from the community, they mainly talk about Mercedes, so for example, MasterCard, Red Bull. Red Bull is now a staple already, but the other two are struggling a little with their perception and how they are perceived by esports fans. But we desperately need non-endemic sponsors even more. What's a reoccurring, I'd say, solution maybe, or a phenomenon that has been talked about a lot and has been recognized by practitioners and research, especially in the past years, is the authenticity of a sponsor itself, but also a sponsorship. Practitioners are already preaching that a sponsorship needs to be authentic, it needs to be honest, it has to have some meaningful value for esports fans and young fans to accept them, to appreciate them. I found this middle quote very fitting. They can smell cringe from miles away. I think that's very true. But also from the research side, authenticity has been a relevant topic. Research, especially in marketing, but more specifically in sponsorship marketing, has been deemed as a cornerstone for successful sponsorship marketing. But also in esports specifically, there are some papers hinting that authenticity positively influences specific sponsorship outcomes, like brand equity, for example, or purchase intention. And it is critical to build credibility, positive associations, and good reputation with fans, which later on leads to loyalty and a new customer group. So to build authenticity is highly important for successful sponsorship in esports, and even more relevant for non-endemic sponsors. But what even is authenticity? It's a very hard question to answer. There are as many authenticity constructs as there are sand on a beach. They are defined very differently. And if we look at a few of those definitions as an example, like brand authenticity is defined as a subjective evaluation of genuineness ascribed to a brand by consumers. So how honest, how genuine a brand is, perceived by consumers. So not how genuine they are actually, but how it is perceived. Or authenticity is a holistic consumer assessment determined by 6 component judgment. That's very specific, refers to those 6 dimensions very specifically. But we also have authenticity in completely other areas that have nothing to do with the traditional marketing space, I would say, or consumer space. For example, in politics, like political authenticity as the degree to which politicians are perceived as true to themselves. Not true to the facts, that's important, but true to oneself. So very different aspect. Or as a last example, corporate social responsibility authenticity was defined as a perception of a company's CSR actions as a genuine and true expression of the company's beliefs and behaviors. So, as you can see, very different depending on the context. So authenticity is highly context specific in their definition, in the dimensions that constitute authenticity, in their measurements, very different items, very different measurement scales. So far, most of research has been done on authenticity of single entities. For example, one brand or one company or one politician. But what we are looking for here in esports sponsoring or sponsorships is the authenticity of the relationship between the sponsor and the sponsored entity. So the brand and, for example, the event or the tournament that is sponsored. So I don't really care, or we don't really care in that area how authentic, I don't know, Red Bull is outside just as a company itself, but we care how authentic Red Bull is as a sponsor in esports, so related to the sponsoring entity. Relationship authenticity is different than what a single entity authenticity might be like. Then authentic to who is another question. So who's the one evaluating the authenticity? This differs from context to context, and they perceive different cues and they judge on different characteristics what authentic is. In our case, the spectators are the interesting party who perceive the sponsorships while they are watching their favorite esports tournament, for example, and then evaluate on what they see as how authentic they think the sponsorship is, and then how they react to that. And also there's a bunch of different possible dimensions of authenticity. Authenticities, it's the one thing that they have in common. It's always defined through their dimensions. But those can be 3, 4, 6, like in Muna's example. So there's also no standard that applies in every context and for every authenticity construct. Which leads us to a problem because we figured out how to make sponsorships maybe more successful, so sponsors are retained more easily and acquired more easily, and authenticity is a very important factor in that. I need to know what authenticity is in that context and how people evaluate it. And there's something called the Horizontal Marketing Partnership Authenticity by Charlton and Cornwell, which also includes sponsorships. So they developed a construct that's a bit broader. It also applies to, for example, co-branding or celebrity endorsement relationships. So between a brand and and then relationship to an entity, another one. And they are working with 4 dimensions, which are continuity, credibility, integrity, and symbolism, adapted from brand authenticity, a brand authenticity scale, a very a famous one from Morhart and colleagues. And they related that to relationships in marketing. But when we look at those dimensions, for example, continuity, it refers to a partnership's timelessness, historicity, and stability over time. What is timelessness in an industry that's only a few years old, or at least growing in the past few years to their own market and industry? What is supposed to be timeless there? What's historicity in that case? Doesn't, like, on first glance, it doesn't really seem to apply that well. And also from a lot of talks with esports fans and people from the industry, informal talks, I heard that there might be something that goes beyond those 4 dimensions. There might be a 5th one. And Charlton and Cornwell already said themselves that their scale and their construct might have to be adapted or even extended depending on the context. And I propose that given the esports industry's unique dynamics and community values, it is likely that the dimensions constituting authenticity require adaptation. So there are 2 main research questions I'll look into. The first thing is a more general one: how do esports spectators perceive and evaluate sponsorships in esports tournaments and events? Where I'm also looking at what characteristics of sponsorships in esports do spectators notice, and how do they interpret those characteristics and form judgments from that. But because I suspect that authenticity is a major influence on those judgments, I need to know what authenticity for esports fans is. And therefore, I'm asking, how do esports spectators perceive and define the authenticity of sponsorships in esports tournaments and events? We are currently planning a study with a qualitative explorative approach, an interview study with semi-structured interviews, where we are following mostly an inductive approach because this field is still very open. There's little input, little research done, and a lot of questions still open. It's also hard to gather information about how people judge or evaluate anything when not asking, giving them the opportunity to freely answer. But we also have a part of a deductive approach because we want to figure out if the 4 dimensions we already have from Charlton and Cornwell apply here, and if there are suffice. We developed interview guidelines in German and English, and we'll use a theoretical sampling approach until saturation. So not sure yet how many interviews there will be. We tested the interview guideline already, but the actual first interviews will only start in the upcoming 2 weeks. And we are planning to analyze our interview data with the Joya method for analyzing qualitative data and building theory, which is a very commonly used one, especially in management and business studies, where I'm rooted in. And to build a model or a theory in the end about what authenticity in sponsorships is to esports fans. I am now looking forward to connecting with you guys and discussing this over some probably virtual coffee instead of last year. And I'm looking forward to get into that with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viola. A really interesting talk there again. We do have a couple of questions from Twitch chat as well. First off, someone says, "Let's go, Viola." So I think they liked it as well. And then the question is, "Great first presentation. I am wondering if authenticity could also just mean that they are cringe for the esports audience, but that way people do perceive it positively, especially for non-endemic brands."
That's a question we were also asking ourselves. If, for example, if I look at those 4 dimensions, if a sponsor can still be authentic if they, for example, openly say, well, I'm just here to make money, but I'm open about it. I'm transparent about it. I just do what I do. If this can still be perceived as authentic, because maybe that honesty dimension is more important for esports spectators than, for example, the integrity. It's not a hypothesis I have, but technically it's possible, which is why we want to look in those dimensions more specifically and figure out which one values more than the other.
Interesting. In your professional opinion, just a question for myself, do you think that is likely to change from different esports titles to different esports titles, or do you think it's more about the audience for those things?
I can imagine that it might change from title to title, maybe not for every title, but if we group them together, because there are some studies about the differences of spectator characteristics for different titles. They sometimes have different economical backgrounds. They also value different values. Well, so it might happen that actually, for example, integrity might be more important for others, or honesty. And sometimes it's also about if you know about the necessity of sponsors and maybe you don't really care for authenticity that much because you know that sponsors are necessary and relevant and needed. So you might be more open to sponsors you might otherwise not accept, just out of those necessity.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Fiona. We are going to be taking a short break here once again, just as we